Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you?
Good morning, Frank. How are you?
Good, thank you.
End of a difficult week in terms of the temperature, colds, and uh, what's happening in Venezuela,
Mm.
sanctions in Iran, and what seems to me to be at the basis of all this, which is the degree to which everything in the world is now being managed financially and is being talked about to some extent by some people in terms of financialization. And I've been watching this for some time, though it's not one of my specialties, and I'm sure I don't really understand as much about it as I ought to. But it does seem to me that more and more, everything that happens in the world, the main principle of organization that underlies it is finance.
Hmm.
The difference between money and finance is money was a way of enabling transactions, and finance is a means of organizing in relation to money. And the way money is being used to organize has been increasing at an accelerating rate ever since banks became important in, what was that, some 700 years ago now.
Yeah, about
Uh,
the 1300s in
so that
Italy.
started with the Lydians and coins
Hmm.
well over 2,000 years ago, and then it was the Italians and their banks in the late medieval period,
Hmm.
and then the stock exchange in London in the beginning of the 17th
Right,
century,
right.
and then the way corporations have developed starting in the 19th century, and now it's become completely global, and the amount of financial power that relates simply to lending and borrowing is decreasing, and it's mainly a question of who's able to do what, given to the extent to which they control all the different means in which things are held that can be immediately translated into monetary value. Am I understanding correctly?
I think so. The only thing I would add in there is that the financialization, if you will, is it's fairly clean in that it's transparent, that you know that everybody involved has the same incentive, and that is to make as much money as they can. You don't have to question people's motives. You're not doing the usual dance of veils that you might be doing in international relations, or trying to understand what one party is actually trying to say when they're doing something else. If you're talking about governing and planning based on financialization, I would say in some ways it's an awful lot more transparent than what we might be normally seeing.
Well, and it relates to the way things are organized through time, as well as the way they're organized globally,
Hmm.
especially because of the way the insurance industry works, I imagine. Um, and we have periodic disasters such as Venezuela, and then what the British were able to do in the early part of the 20th century, and what America has been able to do since the Second World War. And a lot of it is done very constructively, but a lot of it is done in ways that serve one particular purpose and don't serve to any real extent at all the actual improvement of the global situation.
No, not per se, but Venezuela and Iran and Iraq are interesting examples. I mean, they're sitting on top of vast deposits of petroleum, of oil, and even though They've each been taken off the board, so to speak, and the global chess match periodically for some periods of time due to internal issues. Um, they're never gone for long because the people who are, if you will, involved in global finance recognize all too well the amount of resources and the amount of money that those entities, those countries represent to the overall process. And they always have to be brought back to the table. Now, your point is well taken insofar as trying to forecast periodic upheaval. And I agree. Certainly back since the time of Chavez in Venezuela, anybody working at Exxon who had not been scratching their head thinking, wow, maybe at some point we could have a real problem here in Venezuela. We might have difficulty getting our product out. Anybody who hadn't begun to think about that should have been fired. So, I mean, they've seen this coming for a long time. The question is, how long is it going to last? Even in a severe case, like Iran, how long did it last? A generation? And then the oil began to flow again.
Yeah, so I mean, we tend to think more in terms of the resources, whereas the way the resources are controlled depends on the way the financial situation is controlled.
I think so.
And the organization of finance keeps becoming more and more complex. I feel we should say something about derivatives, which have become such an important part of the global financial market. And I think, am I right in saying that that's the latest thing, the latest factor in financial organization and therefore global financialization that has become so important?
Well, they've sort of fallen out of favor since they were one of the main strands of responsibility for one of the last meltdown 10 years or so ago was ascribed to derivatives. And that people were trading and insuring derivatives and they didn't even know what the heck they were doing. They were in fact insuring things that were simply bets that had been made by people who had no ownership stake in what they were betting on. And then they would go to AIG, for example, and ask them to insure the value of the bet's margin if it went up or if it went down. And then neither party to the insurance contract was actually an owner of the instrument that they were betting on. They were just creating a derived instrument based on the other instrument that they had never had possession of. So, I mean, people can get awfully cute, too cute sometimes, and there are always people looking for markets. But what we're talking about on a global scale, when we talk about globalization, in some respects, it's a little easier, as I said, because it's back to financial meat and potatoes. It's okay, what's in the ground? How can we get it out? Is the regime going to be friendly to us? What's the PR price we're going to have to pay if these guys are really bad guys and we're perceived as doing work with them? I mean, that's basic international corporation 101, in my opinion.
But the main thing that you have to be able to control if you want to succeed in the global economy and therefore political globalization is in fact the relationship between assets and debt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we used to think of assets purely in terms of resources like oil, especially since the beginning of the 20th century. But in fact, having oil doesn't necessarily save you anymore.
No. You have to be able to. So tell me what. It's an interesting point. Before we started talking, you talked a little bit about the topic, and then you mentioned in the context of Iran and Venezuela, and even in the context of Trump. And I'd throw it back to you as well as Trump, because when on this shutdown of the government, it was only when the financial disruption to the economy began to become great enough that I think, I hate to say this because it's so unprofessional, but an unseen hand entered the equation and sort of pushed him back to sanity and allowed him to see fit to strike a compromise to reopen the government. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any means, but I think there is a class or a strand in this country and globally that will enter the fray if they think their interests are going to be compromised too severely.
That's an interesting point. But have you noticed how much more we hear in the daily, weekly, monthly news these days about multi-millionaires, multi-billionaires than we used to? So I'm afraid I don't pay that much attention to it, but I've come to think of it because of this subject that we're talking about today. But people like Soros, for example, and what's his name, Bezos, and
yes, Jeff Bezos,
and various other people are much more important in the news now than they ever used to be, and there seem to be more of them, and what they're able to do. And of course, we wouldn't have our current president if he didn't have his billions.
Yes, if in fact he does have his billions. Yes, we don't know that. But your point is well taken. So I'm just it can look pretty bleak from a global perspective if you're on the low opposite side of that 1%, if you're down in that bottom 5 or 10% of the people globally, it's not a pretty picture. I mean, there's no control, there's no say, there's no anything.
And the reason that China is becoming so important is that it's becoming financially important.
Mm-hmm.
But the puzzle is, how do we explain the Soviet system and what's happened to Russia since the end of the Soviet system? Because, well, we understand that there are a lot of Russian billionaires in London, but they seem to need to go to London in order to find their slot in the global economy as billionaires.
Well, yeah, the Soviet system was 20 years ago, remember. I have a fellow outside here. I need to get my wife to come down and do something. 1 second. Sorry about that. There was a fellow, I rent a house to a fellow, and he was standing out there. He was coming at 9:30 to pay the rent. So. And I saw him. I was looking at this, and I could see him in the back. All right. So we're talking about the Soviet system. Now, hang on a second.
Yeah.
But the Soviet system essentially ended 20 years ago, and
yes, but Russia survived it.
Russia survived it, and they seem to have carried the Soviet system along with them. Parts.
Yeah. So it's interesting that the Soviet system. This financialization is really based on capitalism, and the Soviet system was anti-capitalist and survived.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel we should have an explanation for that, and I'm afraid I don't.
Well, I don't either, but maybe it is that the Soviet system itself was not exactly what the Soviet system was supposed to be. And in fact,
well, I think that is the explanation. Yes, but
in fact, it was a bastardized, corrupt version of some sort of strange capitalism. One that Marx had ever seen.
And it was based on oil, presumably, oil and gas. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's probably it. Okay. So now, what this means for the future is very complicated. Because it means that the organization of the world could be badly managed by the successful capitalists, and in a way that would be very bad for the management of the resources that we do still in fact depend upon. And that, of course, is what's happened in Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. In a strange, small-scale way. But that could be a lesson for the global situation.
Well, it certainly bears watching because what's going to happen in Venezuela has not fully played itself out yet. That's for sure.
No, no.
Although discussion of the Russian charter planes carrying the billions of dollars worth of gold back to Moscow. It's very, very unusual stuff. So,
uh,
all right. Well, Professor, thank you very much. We'll
okay.
look forward to next week and have a good week. Thank you.
And same to you. Bye.
Bye.